Death moved quietly through the Britland household, but nothing about it was natural. How could 3 lives collapse in the span of a few months without raising a single alarm? What hidden motive could turn a seemingly ordinary woman into the first female poisoner ever executed in Manchester? Stay with this story, and you will uncover the chilling truth buried behind Mary Ann Britland's deadly ambition. Mary Ann Britland's story did not begin in darkness. It began like many Victorian tales of quiet domestic life, framed by narrow streets, rigid social rules, and a sense of order that made the world appear predictable. Born into a working-class family in 19th century Manchester, she grew up surrounded by the constant struggle to survive. Factories rumbled day and night, and the air smelled of smoke and desperation. In that environment, stability was precious, and a respectable marriage was often the only guarantee of safety. Mary Ann seemed to achieve that when she wed Thomas Britland, a steady worker who provided shelter, food, and a semblance of comfort. Yet beneath that thin layer of normalcy, something far more complicated simmered inside her, a restless dissatisfaction that would eventually ignite into something monstrous. Her life followed the routine rhythm of a typical wife and mother. She kept her home in order, managed her responsibilities, and maintained the image of a woman who conformed to society's expectations. But the truth was that Mary Ann longed for more than duty and survival. She wanted control, freedom, and emotional validation, things she believed she had found outside her marriage. It was during these years that she developed an attachment to her neighbor, a man whose presence offered an escape from the mundane. Their connection remained discreet, never openly acknowledged, but powerful enough to distort her judgment and weaken her restraint. The desire for a different life grew stronger with each passing day. In the spring of that fateful year, an opportunity appeared, small at first, but soon impossibly tempting. Arsenic, a deadly poison easily accessible through common household products, lurked in drugstores disguised as rat killer. It was inexpensive, unregulated, and capable of ending a life swiftly while mimicking the symptoms of natural illness. Many Victorian households purchased it without suspicion. Mary Ann learned of its properties through casual recommendations for pest control, and soon she grasped the horrifying potential it offered. If a person needed to disappear, arsenic could silence them without leaving visible marks. For someone who felt trapped, it was a key disguised as a remedy. Her first target was the man who stood most directly between her and her fantasies of a new life, her husband, Thomas. He was not abusive, cruel, or negligent. In fact, he had no idea his wife harbored any resentment. He trusted her completely, and that trust would become his downfall. Mary Ann began administering the poison gradually, blending it into his food in doses small enough to build symptoms slowly. Thomas fell ill with stomach pain, vomiting, and weakness, symptoms that resembled common infections. Neighbors expressed polite concern. Doctors suspected gastrointestinal issues, and Mary Ann played her role as the anxious wife flawlessly. No one doubted her. As the days passed, Thomas deteriorated rapidly. His body struggled, his energy disappeared, and the agony intensified. But each time someone tried to make sense of his condition, Mary Ann deflected suspicion with quiet tears and a facade of helplessness. Within a short period, Thomas was dead, officially claimed by illness, despite the chaos his body endured behind closed doors. Mary Ann signed the documents, accepted condolences, and continued her life as if the tragedy were merely another misfortune of the harsh Manchester environment. But there was a shadow trailing behind her, quiet but growing. Thomas's death was convenient, far too convenient, and Mary Ann felt the convenience could be replicated. The taste of freedom she expected did not come. Instead, she faced new complications, financial pressures, and emotional instability. What she had hoped would be liberation became a new form of burden. Her thoughts returned to the poison, to the possibility of eliminating any obstacle in her path. It was no longer about escape. It had become something darker, a strategy she was willing to refine. And then she identified her second victim. Before we continue, if you're drawn into this chilling beginning, hit subscribe so you don't miss the unraveling of one of England's most disturbing cases. Now tell me, do you think Mary Ann planned everything from the start, or did she transform into a killer along the way? The second death in Mary Ann Britland's orbit would expose just how calculated her intentions had become. After her husband's passing, she moved with lightning speed to shape her circumstances in a way that raised quiet eyebrows around the neighborhood. She began visiting the Lowe household more frequently, where her close friend, Margaret Lowe, lived with her husband and daughter. To some, Mary Ann's presence seemed like an attempt to seek companionship during her grief. To others, it felt strangely persistent, as if she were circling something invisible yet important. The truth, however, simmered beneath the surface. Mary Ann's attachment to Margaret's husband had evolved into a fixation, and she believed that removing Margaret would unlock a future she had convinced herself she deserved. Margaret Lowe was a gentlewoman, known for her patience and warm nature. She trusted Mary Ann completely, often inviting her into her home for tea, conversation, and the comforting presence of a friend. The bond between them was unspoken but steady, built over years of sharing daily struggles. Yet Mary Ann's ability to mask her intentions was chilling. Behind her friendly smiles and sympathetic words, she carried a secret she was prepared to act upon again. The success of her first killing had shown her how easily she could manipulate illness, grief, and suspicion. Now she only needed to follow the method she believed would never fail. In May of that year, she purchased more arsenic, once again claiming she needed it to deal with pests. The pharmacist, who recognized her as a grieving widow, saw no reason to question the request. With the poison secured, Mary Ann visited Margaret's home with increasing frequency. She often brought small treats, tea blends, and food, disguising her plan in gestures of kindness. At first, Margaret felt nothing unusual, but soon after consuming Mary Ann's offerings, she began displaying the unmistakable symptoms of arsenic poisoning. She complained of stomach pain, nausea, and sudden waves of weakness that left her unable to stand without support. Mary Ann played her role perfectly, offering to help care for her friend while quietly observing the poison's progress. She would sit by Margaret's bed, adjusting her pillows, offering comfort and reassuring her that she would recover soon. But her eyes revealed a different story. She watched every tremor, every cry of pain, every desperate breath with an emotion that hovered between anticipation and certainty. Mary Ann knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew there was no turning back. As Margaret's condition worsened, her husband grew increasingly distressed. He summoned medical help, but Victorian doctors often relied on guesswork when confronted with symptoms resembling severe gastroenteritis. They advised rest, hydration, and prayer. Meanwhile, Mary Ann subtly urged them to remain patient, insisting it was likely a passing illness. Her confidence and calmness made her appear trustworthy, masking the truth with unnerving ease. Margaret's daughter, still young and inexperienced, believed Mary Ann was there to help, unaware that the woman comforting her mother had caused every moment of suffering. Margaret died as quietly as she had lived, her final hours marked by confusion and agony. The household plunged into grief, and Mary Ann offered herself as a pillar of support. She assisted with arrangements, comforted Margaret's daughter, and ensured that the widowed husband never felt alone. She acted out the role so convincingly that no one questioned her presence or motives. Yet inside, she felt a dangerous sense of triumph. 2 deaths, both explained away as natural misfortune. 2 obstacles removed without consequence. But her ambition did not stop there. Something darker had taken root inside her, fueled by a combination of longing, fantasy, and a chilling belief that she was invincible. Margaret's daughter, a girl barely entering adulthood, had also begun falling ill shortly before her mother's death. At first it was subtle, a weakness in her legs, a strange tightness in her stomach, and bouts of dizziness she could not explain. Mary Ann often encouraged her to drink tea or broth she had prepared, insisting it would give her strength. The girl trusted her, unaware that the very things meant to restore her were slowly breaking her body down. The pattern repeated itself with horrifying consistency. Symptoms escalated. Neighbors expressed concern. The widowed father grew frantic at the thought of losing his daughter so soon after losing his wife. Mary Ann, however, showed no hesitation, arriving with food, advice, and a carefully crafted tenderness that completely disguised her true objective. And just as with the previous victims, the young girl's suffering intensified until her body could no longer endure the onslaught of poison. Her death shattered what remained of the Lowe family. The father, now alone, broke under the weight of despair. Yet through it all, Mary Ann stayed close, nurturing the illusion that she was the only constant in his collapsing world. She believed she had positioned herself perfectly, with nothing left standing between her and the future she envisioned. But destiny had already begun shifting around her, quietly but decisively. A series of small coincidences, subtle doubts, and unexpected comments were about to tighten a noose she never saw coming. And as investigators would soon discover, Mary Ann Britland's confidence had made her careless, fatally careless. In the aftermath of the Lowe household tragedies, Mary Ann Britland believed she had perfected the art of vanishing behind grief. She moved through the neighborhood with a strange blend of humility and quiet confidence, offering condolences while subtly reinforcing the idea that tragedy had simply struck twice in the same home. She attended gatherings, visited old acquaintances, and maintained her routine, certain that her mask remained flawless. But beneath the surface of Manchester life, people had begun to whisper. The coincidences felt too heavy, too clustered, and too perfectly aligned with her presence. Those whispers would soon become the first cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Victorian communities relied heavily on observation. People noticed when routines changed, when expressions shifted, and when someone behaved in ways that did not match their circumstances. Mary Ann's behavior after the second and third deaths had not gone entirely unnoticed. She appeared almost too composed, too involved, and too present. Some neighbors recalled how she often arrived just before symptoms worsened. Others remembered her eagerness to help prepare meals or drinks for the victims. And though no one wanted to accuse a grieving widow of anything sinister, the human instinct to sense danger had quietly awakened. The first person to voice genuine concern was a local doctor who had examined both Margaret and her daughter. He found the similarity of symptoms unsettling, and the rapid decline even more so. Though Victorian medicine lacked modern toxicology, experienced physicians could detect patterns. The doctor began reviewing his notes, comparing the timelines, the reactions, and the speed at which both victims deteriorated. A chilling thought crept into his mind. Perhaps these deaths were not natural misfortunes at all. He chose not to accuse anyone, but he shared his doubts with a colleague, searching for clarity. At the same time, Margaret's husband, now tormented by unbearable solitude, began replaying recent events in his mind. He recalled moments when Mary Ann appeared overly eager to help, times she insisted she should prepare the meals, and small details he had dismissed before. The fog of grief had clouded his judgment at first, but as the weeks passed, clarity pierced through. He remembered the strange taste in the tea Mary Ann had made for his daughter. He remembered how she encouraged them to trust her care rather than seek alternative treatments. Most of all, he remembered that Mary Ann had purchased rat poison not long before the illnesses began. A single remark from a neighbor about her frequent pharmacy visits caused a silent terror to take hold of him. Still, suspicions alone were not enough. Victorian society often hesitated to confront wrongdoing, especially when the accused was a woman. But one small detail would change everything. A chemist who had sold arsenic to Mary Ann recalled her calm demeanor when requesting it. She had claimed it was for pests at home, but her repeated visits raised quiet doubts. When he heard of the multiple deaths surrounding her, he finally reported the information to authorities. This simple act, mundane at first glance, became the spark that ignited a full investigation. Police began compiling a list of individuals connected to the recent deaths, and quickly noticed Mary Ann's name linked to all three. They interviewed neighbors, the attending physicians, and the chemist. The testimonies painted a disturbing pattern. Mary Ann was always present, always involved, and always offering food or drink. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that she had recently attempted to purchase a large quantity of arsenic again, supposedly for more pest problems. This time, however, the chemist had refused the sale, uneasy about her earlier purchases. With this information, authorities made the decision to exhume the bodies. Victorian exhumations were grim, painstaking, and emotionally devastating for families, but necessary when foul play was suspected. The remains of Thomas Britland, Margaret Lowe, and her daughter were examined using the limited scientific methods available at the time. Under the guidance of early forensic techniques, chemical tests were performed to detect the presence of arsenic. The results were conclusive and horrifying. All three individuals contained quantities of poison far exceeding anything found in accidental exposure. The discovery sent shockwaves through Manchester. Newspapers seized upon the story, eager to report on the rare and unsettling case of a female poisoner. Victorian society viewed women as gentle and nurturing, so the idea that one could use tenderness as a weapon was deeply disturbing. Rumors spread quickly, painting Mary Ann as a manipulative figure who disguised her ambitions behind a soft smile. Curiosity fueled the public's fascination, but fear fueled their outrage. Investigators now felt confident that the deaths were intentional. They gathered every piece of evidence, from witness statements to the chemist's records, until the case formed a clear and incriminating chain of events. Finally, one evening, they approached Mary Ann at her home. She opened the door with the same carefully practiced expression she had worn for months, unaware that her world was about to collapse. Officers informed her of the suspicions and the results of the exhumations. For the first time, the composure she had relied on began to crack. She hesitated, her mind racing for explanations, excuses, or denials. But the walls around her had closed too tightly, and the weight of her own actions pressed down with suffocating force. The arrest was swift, the charges severe, and the community's shock immediate. Mary Ann Britland was escorted away, leaving behind the fragile illusion she had built, and stepping into a storm of justice she could no longer escape. Yet the most chilling revelations of her motives and her confession had not even begun to surface. Mary Ann Britland's arrest sent a tremor through the courthouse long before her trial officially began. In Victorian England, female murderers were so rare that even seasoned officials grappled with disbelief. Courtrooms had seen thieves, swindlers, and violent men. But a woman who calmly poisoned 3 people, all connected to her daily life, pushed the boundaries of their understanding of human nature. The public, too, swarmed around the developing case, eager for a glimpse of the widow whose face no longer aligned with the gentle roles women were expected to fill. From the moment Mary Ann stepped into her cell, she maintained a complex mixture of denial, anxiety, and an eerie calmness. She asked repeatedly about the evidence, as though hoping that the forensic tests might somehow be flawed. She insisted her intentions had been misunderstood, but investigators knew her reactions were too measured. They watched her closely, waiting for the certainty of the charges to erode her defenses. It did not take long. Days after her arrest, Mary Ann began speaking more openly, not with remorse, but with a quiet desperation to portray herself differently. She portrayed her life as a chain of suffering, implying that her circumstances had pushed her toward unthinkable decisions. Investigators noted that her explanations shifted frequently, as though she was trying to discover which version elicited sympathy. They listened patiently, but the science, the testimonies, and the pattern of the deaths left no doubt. Mary Ann had orchestrated everything. The most disturbing moments came when she finally revealed her fixation on Margaret Lowe's husband. The idea of a new relationship had consumed her mind, twisting her reasoning into something cold and predatory. She admitted that removing Margaret was the first step toward creating the life she wanted. When asked about Margaret's daughter, Mary Ann's justification was chillingly simple. The girl would have stood in the way. Her tone lacked the emotion one might expect when describing the death of a child. Instead, she spoke as though she were addressing inconveniences rather than human beings. The courtroom filled to capacity when the trial began. Reporters lined the aisles, eager to capture every expression and every whispered remark. Mary Ann stood at the center of the storm, her appearance deceptively plain. She did not fit the monstrous image the public imagined, and that paradox only heightened the fascination. The prosecution presented the exhumation results, the chemist's records, and the testimonies of neighbors who had seen her preparing meals or teas shortly before each victim fell ill. Every detail painted a portrait of premeditated calculation. Witnesses described her visits to the Lowe residence, her insistence on caring for the sick, and her suspiciously calm demeanor during the deaths. The attending doctors explained the rapid deterioration of the victims, noting the unusual consistency across all three cases. The chemist testified about her repeated purchases of arsenic, emphasizing the uneasiness he felt, but had ignored until it was too late. Each voice added a layer of precision to the prosecution's case, leaving little room for doubt. Mary Ann's defense struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. They attempted to portray her as a grieving, overwhelmed widow who had been unfairly targeted by rumors, but the facts simply overpowered the narrative. Her shifting explanations, her clear motive, and the scientific findings created a chain too strong to break. Even when she tried to cry or show distress, the court sensed calculation behind the tears. The turning point of the trial arrived when the judge allowed portions of her confession to be read aloud. The room fell silent. Mary Ann described her motives in stark, unsettling terms, admitting that she believed removing certain people would pave the way for a happier future. The language she used was almost clinical, lacking empathy or remorse. Gasps echoed through the gallery as the audience absorbed the coldness of her reasoning. Even those who had entered the courtroom, hoping for a twist or a misunderstanding, felt their hope evaporate. As the prosecution concluded, they framed Mary Ann as a woman whose desire for control had spiraled into unrestrained violence. Their arguments were hauntingly persuasive, painting her crimes as acts of selfish ambition rather than emotional impulsiveness. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, the entire courtroom held its breath. It took only a short time for them to return. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Mary Ann's sentence was equally swift. She would be executed by hanging, the ultimate punishment under English law. The announcement rippled through the courtroom, producing a mixture of horror, fascination, and grim satisfaction. Mary Ann herself remained still, absorbing the words with a strange detachment. For the first time, she understood that the fantasy she had chased had not only destroyed the lives of her victims, but had led her directly to the gallows. Yet even as the verdict sealed her fate, one final chapter remained her last days, her final words, and the chilling calm she carried with her as she approached the end. After the verdict, Mary Ann Britland was transferred to Strangeways Prison, a place known for its cold stone walls and the heavy silence that lingered in every corridor. Prison officials watched her closely, expecting hysterics, denial, or pleas for mercy, but she surprised them. Her reaction was not one of panic, but of eerie composure. She asked for little, spoke softly, and displayed a calmness that unsettled those assigned to guard her. It was as if she had accepted her fate long before the judge spoke the final words. Her cell was small, lit only by a narrow window that allowed a sliver of daylight to stretch across the floor. The days passed slowly, marked only by the quiet footsteps of guards and the distant echoes of other prisoners. Mary Ann spent most of her time isolated, her thoughts hidden behind a mask she rarely removed. She occasionally requested writing materials, though she produced very little. When asked if she wished to send letters to family or friends, she declined, stating that there was no one left who would welcome her words. But beneath the silence, emotions twisted inside her. At times, she appeared haunted, pacing her cell as though replaying the events that had led her there. At other moments, she seemed disconnected from reality, sitting motionless for hours with an expression that defied interpretation. Guards whispered among themselves, debating whether she was resigned to her fate or simply incapable of confronting the enormity of her actions. Spiritual advisors visited regularly, offering prayer and moral guidance. One chaplain formed a peculiar rapport with her, noting that she alternated between moments of sincerity and flashes of defensiveness. She confessed fragments of her reasoning to him, not to seek forgiveness, but to justify herself. She spoke of loneliness, of longing, and of the overwhelming desire to reshape her life at any cost. Yet she never fully acknowledged the human cost of her choices. The chaplain left each visit with the impression that Mary Ann understood the mechanics of her crimes, but not their emotional impact. As the execution date approached, the public's fascination reached its peak. Newspapers published detailed accounts of her trial, speculating about her state of mind and portraying her as both a cold manipulator and a tragic figure warped by circumstance. Crowds gathered outside the prison in the days leading up to the hanging, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous poisoner. Victorian England's obsession with crime was deeply rooted in fear and curiosity, and Mary Ann's case fed both. Inside the prison, preparations were made with somber precision. The executioner reviewed the measurements, selected the rope, and ensured that everything met the strict standards required by law. The process was methodical, unemotional, and stripped of spectacle. Still, the weight of what was about to occur hung heavily in the air, felt by every guard, chaplain, and official involved. They were not merely carrying out a sentence. They were ending the life of the first woman ever executed at Strangeways. On the evening before the execution, Mary Ann displayed an unexpected shift in demeanor. She became reflective, even fragile. She asked the chaplain to return, and for the first time, expressed fear. Not fear of death itself, but fear of what awaited her afterward. She wondered aloud whether her actions would follow her into eternity, whether the faces of those she had poisoned would confront her beyond the physical world. The chaplain reassured her, reading passages meant to soothe her conscience, but it was clear that something deep inside her had finally cracked. That night, she barely slept. Guards observed her sitting upright on her cot, her hands clasped tightly, her breathing shallow. The calmness she had maintained since her arrest dissolved into quiet trembling. When dawn finally arrived, she appeared exhausted, her eyes hollow but strangely resolute. The final hours had arrived. The execution was scheduled shortly after sunrise. A small group of officials gathered outside her cell, waiting for the moment they would escort her to the gallows. She was given a final meal, which she barely touched, and one last opportunity to speak her mind. She whispered only a few words, a cryptic acknowledgment of her guilt, and a final plea for divine mercy. Those present sensed that her composure was slipping, replaced by a raw confrontation with the irreversible reality ahead. When the guards approached to lead her to the execution chamber, she hesitated, gripping the edge of her cot as though hoping to anchor herself to something solid. Her steps were slow and unsteady. The corridors felt endless, echoing with every footfall as she walked toward the place where her life would end. The air grew heavier with each turn, until the gallows finally came into view. And in that moment, just before she ascended the wooden platform, a tremor of absolute terror crossed her face, revealing the truth she had kept hidden for months. She was finally afraid. If this dark journey is gripping you, hit subscribe to follow the shocking final chapter of Mary Ann Britland's story. Now tell me, do you think her final moments were genuine fear, or just another mask slipping at last? The execution chamber at Strangeways Prison was stark and solemn, its wooden beams and heavy iron fittings absorbing the dim morning light. As Mary Ann Britland stepped into the room, a hush fell over the small assembly of officials. The air was thick with tension, as if the very walls recognized the gravity of what was about to happen. She hesitated at the threshold, her breathing uneven, her hands trembling against the coarse fabric of her prison gown. For months she had worn a mask of cold restraint, but now, with the final seconds of her life unfolding in front of her, every crack in that facade was exposed. The executioner, a man known for his steady hands and quiet demeanor, approached her with deliberate calm. He guided her toward the platform, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the procedure. Mary Ann's steps faltered. She looked around the chamber, as though searching for an escape that she knew did not exist. The chaplain murmured a final prayer beside her, but she barely seemed to hear him. Her gaze drifted upward, then downward, then toward the faint sliver of light pushing through the high window. Perhaps she expected something divine to intervene, or perhaps she simply hoped for a final absolution. Neither came. The noose hung at the center of the platform, stark and unforgiving. When the executioner lifted it toward her neck, Mary Ann recoiled slightly, the instinctive reaction of someone meeting the reality of death face to face. But she did not resist. The rope was placed around her neck, tightened with professional precision, and adjusted to ensure a swift and legal execution. Her breaths grew short and frantic, and for the first time, her eyes filled with tears, not the restrained sorrow she had shown in court, but an overwhelming flood of fear that washed away every semblance of control. The officials stepped back. A nod signaled that everything was ready. In those final moments, Mary Ann whispered something so faint that only the chaplain heard it. Some believed it was a plea for forgiveness. Others speculated it was the name of one of her victims. The chaplain never repeated the words, carrying them silently to his grave. Whatever she said, it came from a place of desperation, a final attempt to reconcile the life she had lived with the fate she now faced. The executioner pulled the lever. The mechanism snapped open, and Mary Ann Britland dropped through the trapdoor. The motion was swift, mercifully so, but the image left a chilling mark on everyone present. Her body swung only briefly before growing still. Within minutes, the physician confirmed her death. The first woman ever executed at Strangeways had met her end, and the chamber fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the shifting of boots on wooden planks. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered since dawn. Rumors spread quickly, some exaggerated, others solemn, but all described the same thing: the death of a woman who had shattered Victorian expectations of femininity. People debated whether she had acted out of passion, madness, or pure ambition. Some pitied her, insisting she was a product of desperation. Others felt only horror at the calculated nature of her crimes. But one thing united them all: her case would linger far beyond that morning. In the days that followed, newspapers across England recounted every detail of her trial and execution. Articles dissected her motives, her demeanor, and the chilling precision of her poisonings. Illustrations depicted her with wide, haunted eyes, transforming her into a symbol of both fascination and fear. Crime historians would later remark that what disturbed the public most was not just the murders themselves, but how ordinary she appeared before committing them. Her crimes forced society to confront a darker truth. Evil could wear a familiar face. Margaret Lowe's surviving relatives struggled to make sense of the devastation that Mary Ann had unleashed. The widowed husband, who had once considered her a friend, withdrew from public life. His grief, compounded by guilt and confusion, left scars that would never fully heal. The neighborhood where the murders occurred became steeped in uneasy quiet, as though no one dared speak too loudly about what had transpired. For years, people avoided the topic, fearful of awakening old ghosts. As for Strangeways Prison, Mary Ann's execution became part of its grim history, remembered as one of the most unsettling cases ever carried out within its walls. Guards who had witnessed the hanging recalled her final expression with a mixture of discomfort and dread. It was not the face of a woman resigned to justice. It was the face of someone who had finally realized the magnitude of her own darkness. In the decades that followed, Mary Ann Britland's story lived on through court documents, crime reports, and whispered retellings. Her descent into murder, driven by twisted longing and unrestrained desire, remained one of the most disturbing examples of how far a person might go when trapped between fantasy and obsession. She had believed poison would free her. In the end, it defined her, and long after her body was laid to rest, the unanswered question lingered like a shadow. Was Mary Ann consumed by an impossible dream, or was she simply incapable of seeing the humanity in those she destroyed?